Mixed martial arts has long been a sport centered around single combat. One fighter, one opponent, one cage. But there have been attempts to reimagine the sport by doing something completely the polar opposite, something unheard of, incorporating a team-based format. Some of you may have been paying attention to the recent news about the GFL, or at the very least you saw some of their hilariously bad AI advertising. Their stated goal has been to bring more of a league structure to MMA, turning it from strictly a one-on-one sport into a team-based one. Well, it would appear the GFL is already crashing and burning before even holding their first event. But it might have at least been an interesting idea. What might it look like if their events went ahead? Well, I'm here today to deliver a history lesson, because 20 years ago, another promotion called the IFL, the International Fight League, tried pretty much that exact same thing. And with the backing of millions upon millions stars actively participating, it still went up in flames. I'm Balian from MMA On Point, and this is the self-destructive story of the International Fight League. Chapter 1. MMA in 2006. To understand the inception of the International Fight League, its idea for team-based combat sports, and the impact its announcement was about to make on the MMA world, we of course need to look at the state of mixed martial arts in 2006. This is where it all began for the IFL. Now at the time, this wasn't exactly the golden era of MMA. It was basically still fighting for legitimacy. While today the UFC dominates global MMA and is widely accepted as the premier sports organization, back then MMA was only just beginning to break into the mainstream and still had a ton of stigma attached to it from previous UFC bloodsport marketing campaigns and, well, just general lack of understanding and explanation of what was going on to a wider audience.
These days, the National Street Corner is on TV, where millions are being drawn to a new kind of fight called mixed martial arts, or MMA. Not long ago, the sport was banned as too vicious for decent society.
People are watching, delivering huge ratings for Spike TV, gaining more male viewers in a key demographic than even the baseball playoffs. Don't know much about ultimate fighting. Can you gouge somebody in the eye?
No, that's completely illegal.
I hate to go into this. Can you kick somebody in the groin?
Nope, no groin strikes are allowed.
The question is, should ultimate fighting be banned throughout the United States? What are we, ancient Rome here? Is it going to be like lions in the ring next? You can understand that, can't you?
Not at all. This is mixed martial arts. There's never been a death or serious injury in the 12-year history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship.
I mean, the UFC had struggled for years against legal troubles, political opposition, and a general perception that MMA was, too violent and unregulated. It wasn't until 2005, with the explosion in popularity of the Ultimate Fighter reality show on Spike TV, that the UFC truly began to take off. The show's finale, with Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar, that fight, that was the literal turning point. That single event alone brought in a wave of new fans and showed network executives that MMA could be viable for television. It makes sense then that a man who idolized Marvel heroes as a child and was also a businessman from New York, Garib Sheamus, saw the recent boom of MMA and tried to create something never seen before. The concept for the International Fight League was his brainchild, and he called another man, Kurt Otto, a real estate developer and a businessman who had grown a serious passion for this new sport, MMA. Together, these two men looked at the landscape, saw what they thought was untapped potential, and for the rest of 2005 started to develop an idea that they intended to not only take over the world of MMA, but completely rebrand and change how the sport worked. They believed their vision for a new league was going to attract more fans to the sport than ever. Sheamus was quoted saying at the time, "I'm constantly scouring the world markets to identify what guys will be into next. I saw ultimate fighting as a burgeoning sport with the potential to get really hot." First off, someone should tell this dude it's called mixed martial arts before he buys this thing, honestly. But in essence, at least to them, their idea was simple. Create a structured MMA league built around teams competing against each other. Shouldn't be that hard, right? I mean, it's what the NFL or the NBA do. But that's not all. To go along with the whole reality format the Ultimate Fighter had had so much success with, they wanted to make all these guys train together like a team and film it. They tried to break ground in a lot of areas. They structured the league so fighters would get a fairer share of profits and put fighters on a salary rather than paying them per fight. I mean, they had a whole list of things they wanted to do. Health benefits, all sorts. Sound familiar? The IFL promised stability and a new way to experience MMA. But while the idea was ambitious, the execution would prove far more difficult than they anticipated. Could a team-based league succeed in a sport that had already always been defined by individual achievement? And more importantly, could it compete with the rising juggernaut that was the UFC?
I love this sport, and I started this company because I love the sport and I love the fighters, and I'm proud of where we're going, and I know where this thing is going, and we're just going to keep spoon feeding it out, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but we're doing some unbelievable things.
Certainly out of the gate, they seem to have deep enough pockets, but the world of mixed martial arts is perhaps as unstable as any sport has ever been. But I don't think even the IFL knew exactly what they were in for. At least they were going to do things differently.
We do not use a cage.
Now, there were a lot of other smaller organizations going around at the time, like Strikeforce, King of the Cage, WEC, but here's the key difference. They all started out as a regional promotion in a specific area, then grew in size and scaled their operations. Strikeforce focused on one market, the Bay Area of California. It spent money on top guys like Frank Shamrock, but mostly promoted fights between up-and-coming local guys who could draw fans in that one region, and then it grew from there. The first thing to realize is that the IFL founders and investors had no interest in starting as one of the little ones and trying to grow into one of the big players. They wanted to throw as much money into this thing as they could and kick things off in direct competition with the biggest promotions out there. Between the UFC and Pride, almost all the big name fighters were already under contract. So the IFL started out by inking deals with the biggest names they could, which turned out to be mostly retired fighters who would instead act as coaches. Honestly, it's not that bad of an idea to get fans interested, and guys like Renzo Gracie, Pat Miletich, Bas Rutten, they were all known to MMA fans. But was that really going to get people that were going to buy tickets just to see fighters that these legends had coached? But before any of that could take place, first they had a few battles outside of the cage, mainly legal ones, because the UFC immediately took them to court. They were suing them for having access to their proprietary information. In other words, 2 ex-UFC employees had been apparently hired by the IFL. And the IFL sued them right back, saying that they were threatening potential partners, and it was all going to court March 2nd, 2006, just a few days before the first IFL event. The IFL was saying they were on the verge of signing a big contract with Fox Sports to broadcast its league when, allegedly, the UFC and Dana White threatened to sue Fox Sports if the TV network signed the contract. They were basically accusing the UFC of trying to crush their new business. The UFC, though, had a completely different story. They said the IFL hired UFC staff whilst under a non-competition agreement, and with that came trade secrets belonging to the UFC. They went so far as to say the heads of the IFL, Otto and Sheamus, were given backstage passes to UFC 55 so they could see the operations. But this was something the IFL argued against. They said it was made up. The staff member's non-compete agreement had ended before he went to work for the IFL. Sheamus and Otto, though, were apparently at UFC 55, so the question is, what were they really doing there? It's very unlikely the UFC would have willingly let rival promoters into the venue to see how things work, so there might have been something to what the UFC had accused them of. Pat Miletich was asked by Sherdog what he thought at the time, and he told them in his mind the IFL was going to make Dana White mad eventually, and that he was blaming them for hiring a guy who was qualified and his feelings were hurt over the employee leaving the UFC. Whatever the truth, guys, the UFC were coming for the IFL, and they were willing to cripple them in court. But the IFL was here to compete with $20 million in capital to spend. As the saying goes though, starting out with a lot of money is a good way to lose a lot of money. And another good way to lose a lot of money is to immediately get caught up in a legal battle. Pat Miletich gave a sworn statement in court regarding the UFC. When Dana had made a joke about the IFL, Shamrock took Dana aside to explain he thought the IFL was going to be good for the sport, while Frank Shamrock alleged that Dana White said, "I'm going to fucking crush these guys and anyone associated with them." Shamrock had also said Dana was upset about losing those staff members. And Miletich said that Dana also made threats to Shamrock and Randy if they worked with the IFL. All of these legal disputes, though, were settled with undisclosed agreements, and both lawsuits were dismissed. The IFL was going to go ahead with their first show, and they needed a big impact on the MMA fanbase if they were going to succeed. Chapter 2: The UFC Killer. Word of a new MMA league quickly spread across the community, and once the television deal with Fox was signed, the first show was ready for April 26, 2006. The show was going to air on Fox Sports Net to a home audience in a way MMA had never been broadcast before, a whole 5 years before the UFC would ever sign with the broadcaster. So going into the first season, and for the first IFL show, they were going to have just 4 teams going head-to-head in what they were calling the semi-finals of their championship, and each team was headed by its legendary coach. Bas Rutten and the Los Angeles Anacondas, Pat Miletich and the Quad City Silverbacks, Renzo Gracie and the New York Pitbulls, and the Seattle Tiger Sharks under Maurice Smith. Several more legendary coaches and teams were added later in the year as the show moved into a second season, but the IFL also used the promise to match these coaches up in super fights to help sell their show. Bas Rutten, though, it was heavily teased he'd be taking on another coach returning to the ring, and both Miletich and Smith said the same thing. The semi-finals would be taking place with each of these 4 teams having 5 fighters from all the weight classes at the time, lightweight up to heavyweight. Each team's fighter would battle the other from the same weight class, and the first season of the IFL took place over just 2 events. You do have to admit, it makes more sense than the Ultimate Fighter, where the guys you are training with eventually become the guys you have to fight. At least in the IFL, these were all actual teammates who were in different weight classes and would be competing for victories in the best of 5 matchups every event to see which team would come out on top. But did I mention that the plan for the first ever show was to introduce the format, explain the rules, introduce the coaches and the teams, and get all 5 fights done inside a 45-minute time window?
Welcome to Trump Taj Mahal, and welcome to the world premiere of International Fight League. The Silverbacks against the Anacondas, coached by legend Boss Root, world champion Pat Miletich.
Mostly though, for a first show, things didn't seem to go too bad. It was MMA, but a bit modified. The thing is, there seemed to be so little time spent on actually promoting the fighters or introducing who they were, it kind of made the whole team thing seem a bit pointless. But worse than that, these teams were completely not fair. The first fight matchup put a 25-fight veteran against a fella who was just 1-1. Well, how about an 8-4 dude who had to fight the guy with nearly 50 fights?
Pit bulls, well, they're more like puppies. They have 3 fighters tonight who are making their pro debut.
But at the same time, there were also legit guys like Ben Rothwell, who it seemed like the perfect format for. They also tried some cool things like real-time corner advice with camera shots. And there was an attempt as well to educate the fans. Bass broke down techniques that were used in the fight. That was a cool idea. Obviously though, they were trying to fill a television spot. And so, well, they did sometimes just skip entire rounds of fights and not really even explain what happened. Just that we were in the 3rd round now and basically the fight hadn't really been worth watching, I guess. And given that there were 5 fights a show, after the Silverbacks had already gone up 3-1, it meant that the final fight of the night was, kind of pointless in the team format. It went ahead anyway, but you could already see how doing teams might actually be a bit of a problem. The IFL were also making it clear that they wanted to be viewed differently from the other promotions around, offering something close to an actual job.
This is really about the fighters. This is an opportunity for these guys to be a full-time professional athlete. With the system that we put in place, this is not about the IFL, this is about the fighters and it's about the coaches. It's about creating something different, creating a professional fight league that's never been done before.
Of course, the cage-side appearances of popular figures from the MMA world certainly helped raise their profile.
It's kind of weird. The nice thing about it, I think, is that you get to see some of the the past UFC veteran coaching some of the young up-and-coming guys. I think that's great.
I like the concept. I hope this works. I mean, I hope it gets so successful that there's 32 teams and there's a draft and then players start getting traded.
Another problem is MMA is also super unpredictable. Like, there were guys like Matt Horich with 22 fights going up against someone like Patterson who made his debut, but he still managed to choke him out. So
Patterson looks really close to, and he got him! He got him! Rear naked choke victory for that man there!
Really, the key concept, the team-based format, scoring points for your team, trying to win overall, that part of it, well, I was kind of into it. That being said, there were other problems, like fighters being hurt and having to then compete for their team on the next event.
Last fight, I hurt my hands. I couldn't throw much right hands, and I threw one. I clipped them, and it hurt.
For what they had wanted to achieve, the IFL put out a fairly solid show. It was MMA, it was a little rushed and terribly match-made, but it was as advertised. After their debut, a few things became clear. While big heavyweights like Ben Rothwell were getting a good platform to score knockouts, and it was super entertaining, didn't take away from what only felt like a lot of red flags in this first show. It clearly hadn't been thought through with the team so wildly mismatched, and there wasn't even enough time to show all the fights during the television window, and a lot of the other production elements, the garish team logos, the blue canvas, it just wasn't even the best looking product to viewers either. The team point scoring though, well, that was new and seen as quite innovative and got a lot of attention from the community. But on Fox, it was still drawing ratings and garnering attention. The IFL went from just 2 shows to 4, with a total of 10 hours of broadcasting time, which went out to millions of viewers. They even picked up brands like Xbox, Coca-Cola, and Suzuki. By September 2006, even more changes were coming. New teams had been added, led by Matt Linland, Carlos Newton, Don Frye, and Marco Huas. And the first of the coaches' super fights were actually going ahead when Renzo Gracie and Pat Miletich went toe-to-toe, giving fans exactly what they wanted as a cherry on top. Legends fighting legends.
Pat may be in trouble here. Pat just tapped out. That's it.
Things had gone so well that by November, exactly 7 months after its inaugural event, the IFL made a public stock offering. They wanted more money so they could keep growing, so they could compete with the UFC. And because of a 60 Minutes feature that had gone out about MMA, talking about it being the next NASCAR and the biggest growing sport, the interest from investors exploded. The IFL began trading publicly amongst a ton of hype. They used their position as a team-based league format similar to other sports to get a lot of interest for excited investors that wanted to put some money into MMA. The UFC was a pay-per-view model and the IFL was different. They were a potential competitor and that attracted people to want to invest in them as well. The IFL was also on Fox. The UFC wasn't. On paper, it seemed to some like they had the better distribution, and the IFL could tell all their sponsors and investors their exact schedule and time slots for every single event. the UFC ran their pay-per-views when they happened. It seems that a tremendous amount of hype around MMA inflated the IFL's budget. Shares shot from $4 to $17 by January 2007, a market cap on par with some of the most prosperous professional franchises. But going public for the IFL actually turned into somewhat of a disaster. Although they'd run their shows successfully throughout 2006, the initial shows had cost way more money than they had made. The business foundations, they weren't really there. There was just the promise that the IFL, with their TV deal and new take on the sport, were going to be a competitor to the UFC. So now, with more money than ever, the IFL stacked up their giant pile of cash and started burning through it, ready to build a product that they had promised so many could compete with the UFC. But the reality of that statement was far from the truth. The first year of the IFL ended as Pat Miletic's Quad City Silverbacks dominated throughout the year. Ben Rothwell destroyed people and got 4 finishes, staying undefeated. Future UFC fighter Rory Markham won 4 fights that year, all by knockout, and Bart Palazeski beat 5 straight opponents and won the championship for the team. Optically, it had been a very good year for the IFL, but things were very quickly about to change. Chapter 3: A New Network. Now, with $20 million raised in capital, weekly TV shows on Fox Sports Net and possible expansions into other networks and plans to expand internationally, the IFL moved into 2007 with 13 events planned across the country. Before the new year in December, CBS reported the IFL was valued at more than $150 million. Again, it seemed on paper the UFC had been right to be concerned about the IFL possibly finding success. It was right around this time as well that the perception of MMA was starting to change. The sport had become a success with standout champions like Matt Hughes representing with college degrees in their back pocket. These guys were starting to be looked at like athletes, which is exactly what the IFL wanted for everybody. But even though there hadn't been any major problems, one thing they were struggling with was their TV deal. The IFL events were shown on tape delay and in different time slots all over the country. They needed a better TV network, and Garib Sheamus wanted a powerhouse. And for another twist of fate in this tale, the company they contacted were the future owners of the UFC, WME. The IFL thought they were the company that could take them from the small time to the big time. At the time, WME was considerably smaller and its focus was much narrower. It represented mainly talent in entertainment fields like TV, movies, music, and had very little experience in combat sports. But with the agency's help, the IFL lined up and secured a network TV deal with My Network TV. Now, this new deal would see the IFL stay on Fox, but also expand its viewership with a new series airing on Monday nights called IFL Battlegrounds. This would be on the new network and would be a full live broadcast as opposed to the edited shows that would appear on Fox. But this new Battleground show would bring a lot of changes, and not all of them were good. With their 13 events planned and new coaches Ken and Frank Shamrock, they were promising a lot. And the best way they thought to kickstart their new show was to put out a rap song.
The girls all
This was no longer the same product as it had been on Fox Sports Net. It was over the top and made the sport look completely ridiculous.
Passion makes them powerful. Discipline makes them dangerous. Combat makes them champions.
Either way, the trailer that debuted with the sound of someone getting flatlined and emphasizing the fact that people's lives and health were on the line didn't really resonate with the general MMA fan base. It was like taking a step 10 years backwards. I mean, this shit was just confusing at times.
And this 4-second moment in time from last November is what they all have in common. A controversial moment that you'll see and get a chance to vote on at IFL.tv.
Like, what is actually happening? And it didn't help that the man who took over as the CEO was Jay Larkin, someone who looked at what the IFL had tried to achieve in sort of generating a new type of competition for MMA and started to quite literally wind the clock back towards UFC 1.
I do believe the fans are drawn by the blood. That provokes the obvious question of, well, how far do you go?
The show aired, and it was bad. For starters, the fights didn't even have round timers. Sometimes they skipped entire rounds and joined fights just to show the finishes. And it was all about sensationalizing everything.
Well, I'm an athlete, but it actually means red well, which in break translation down more is with river of blood.
Battlegrounds drew criticism from fans and media alike. One reporter said, watching IFL Battleground is the equivalent of watching TNA Impact, produced by a boxing guy who picked up a tape of UFC in 1993 and decided that is how you market an MMA product on free-to-air television. Reporter Zach Arnold wrote, after watching the debut of the IFL Battleground, I was embarrassed to be an MMA fan. The show was so ridiculous, I felt sorry for the fighters, coaches, and staff involved. When CBS reached out to Dana White to ask about Jay Larkin, he told them this: "They're just bad guys. They're in it for the wrong reasons. Jay Larkin is a guy I talked to 5 years ago that wouldn't put it on Showtime. These are all guys who didn't have the passion for it, didn't like it, and didn't see a future in it." And the reality is, in an effort to appeal to a fan base they thought existed, they actually completely removed themselves from the one they needed the most: the MMA hardcore fan base. And as the IFL's primetime slot shrank, so did its audience. The first Battleground show clocked in an average viewership of 1.1 and a household rating of 0.8. Now, at the time, the UFC's Ultimate Fighter was actually having a down year, one of their worst ever since they started. Last year, in 2006, Season 4 kicked off with some solid numbers. 2.0 for the first 3 episodes at least. But when Season 5 dropped in 2007, the debut episode had a rating of just 1.4, and it was considered pretty bad. And it had even dropped as low as 1.0 the following weeks, which also was pretty worrisome. So the IFL's Battleground show, starting out with a rating of 0.8, was decently competitive, I suppose, at the time. Of course, though, that was nothing compared to the finale of the tough season that year, which hit a 3.0. And big UFC fights like Tito vs Ken Shamrock managed to pull in a 4.3. So these numbers from the IFL certainly weren't coming anywhere near close to some of the bigger UFC offerings at the time. It didn't help that fighters like Rothwell and Jay Hiron beefed publicly with IFL executives over pay and contracts, undermining the IFL's claims to be an organization that put its fighters first. And I found an article from an IFL employee who at the time described what it was like during the shows in that era. He explained that the executive salaries were super high and the advertising budget was completely ridiculous. At one point, the IFL was paying 6 figures to some entertainment industry marketing dude whose contribution to the company was booking music acts. His co-worker then found public records to find out what it had cost the IFL and then used that to renegotiate his own contract, pointing out if they had that much money to spend on terrible ideas, then they should be paying him more, and the IFL gave him a raise. Watching IFL Battlegrounds, you had no normal storylines. You just had a phony emphasis on pushing violence. Someone even said there's a difference between pro wrestling style marketing and the old early UFC marketing, and it was clearly on display with the IFL Battleground show. Another major problem was that the drama and over-the-top intensity of the show seemed so manufactured and fake. I mean, at no point do you get a sense from the promotion that it's really letting the fighters show truly all of their charisma.
Dear Don, there's been a rumor that you stole the mustache from Freddie Mercury. Is this true?
And I think Zach Arnold probably said it best at the time. Battlegrounds isn't about pushing the team concept, it's about doing 7 teasers to put over a stretcher job on the show. It almost came off as a parody of MMA. Luke Thomas even wrote back in 2007 that the IFL is so concerned making something going on during the programming that they run roughshod over the most critical aspects of combat athletics: creating stars. It is a task that takes time, and it's safe to say the sand in the hourglass may be shifting too quickly. Chapter 4: The Downfall. By October 2007, the viewership had gone down from just over 1 million to 360,000. Major advertising and distribution deals never materialized. The IFL reported revenue of $1.6 million in the first quarter, but apparently just staging those 4 events cost them $5.6 million. But somehow, going into what seemed like a doomed 2008, the league got another $12.6 million in funding. Larkin was dead set on engineering one of the biggest comebacks in MMA history. He promised to retool the organization, cut staff, travel, and the event schedule, production costs. The $1 million budget per show was trimmed down to just $125,000. But guess what else he also had to do? Get rid of all the perks the IFL had promised the fighters. Goodbye to the monthly stipends. He restricted their medical coverage, saying the perks were great, but they didn't square with the hard facts of the real world. The IFL has been fair and generous to the point of putting itself out of business. Then you should probably have never done that in the first place, should you? In a final notion of complete defeat, he completely cut out the team-based format. When it came time to renegotiate a TV deal, nobody wanted them. They even spoke to ESPN at the time, and they had no interest in picking them up, despite running UFC highlights on SportsCenter. The final blow may have been when Elite XC announced itself as another major player in the combat sports scene in May, and at the same time rubbed it in the IFL's face by signing a multi-year pact with its part owner, CBS. And in their very first telecast, they brought out Kimbo Slice. He alone increased the network's average ratings among men 18 to 34 by 271%. And that spring, the IFL reported losses of $32 million. By June 2008, it was reported that they had just $2 million of that left. Its share price hovered around 2 cents right in the danger zone, and reports were suggesting that the company was literally fighting for its life. July came, MMA Fighting reported they needed to be purchased or would be shut down, and then in August, when things were looking really bad, they tried to incorporate new gimmicks, the Hex, a six-sided ring that never got any use. And then the following month, Jay Larkin was ready to call it quits. He told Sherdog, "You don't always know what you've got till it's gone." Yeah, I don't think you ever had it, mate. He also said, "The bottom line is, I feel MMA is a one-organization industry. I think the UFC has done a spectacular job of branding, and the UFC has become synonymous with MMA, and there's a couple of hangers-on now." Larkin officially announced the cancellation of their next show in August, the IFL now completely devoid of fans, funds, sponsors, and marketable personalities, with the entire organization rapidly imploding. The famous fighters as coaches had worked initially, but ultimately viewers were tuning in to watch the fights, not a few seconds of a former fighter appearing on television. It's a big gamble to try and pull and then maintain viewership based on former stars who only have their most viral and entertaining moments behind them. These days, MMA is perhaps even more of a one-show business than it ever was before, with Bellator and the PFL now merged, becoming even more consolidated. Of course, signing already famous fighters makes sense, but without future stars and talent, how long can any promotion really last? Ultimately, the IFL never succeeded in promoting and building individual stars. Even Elite XC had Kimbo Slice and Gina Carano, the WEC, Uriah Faber, Strikeforce, Frank Shamrock, Gilbert Melendez, Kung Lee. The IFL, on the other hand, had a questionable camp system where no single fighter was given more attention than their legendary coach. The cost for them, the overhead, and production just ultimately outreached any earnings they could make. They made the fatal error of believing that solid matchups between up-and-comers should have been enough to make an MMA league marketable. And you tell me if I'm wrong in thinking that personalities create interest, not just talent. These days, only promotions like Ryzen or KSW, who have many years now focused on promoting and selling tickets within their specific region of the world and building their own local talent, have managed to not merely stay alive, but actually thrive. According to One and PFL, by their own leadership, they've both been losing money hand over fist for years. And that's what brings us back to the Global Fight League, the GFL, the latest competitor to find itself in direct competition with the UFC on an international scale that is also experiencing major issues. You would have thought that having executives behind the GFL that have been involved in MMA for many years, opposed to the IFL bringing in these out-of-touch promoters, you would think that that genuinely shows a level of understanding that the GFL have that the IFL just never did. But the Global Fight League project, well, apparently they couldn't even get enough funding to get their first event off the ground. Despite announcing the league, doing a live draw for the matchups, and announcing an entire roster of ex-fighters, as well as even booking them for specific dates, apparently before their first two shows in May, well, their major investor pulled out. And so they have no choice but to cancel both dates. And since then, there's been zero word on what's next. In fact, Ariel Helwani, after speaking to Andy Foster, the head of the Californian State Athletic Commission, said, quote, "There are serious doubts about the future of the promotion. This thing might already be dead before it's even held its first event." The GFL is nothing but a logo and a bunch of AI leftovers at this point. I mean, with what they've done so far, it basically never really existed. And it's also left many fighters who put their careers on hold or agreed to big paydays and contracts just in complete limbo about what is happening and if there will ever be an event. I don't think there will be. At the end of the day, I'm reminded of this quote from ex-Bellator matchmaker Mike Kogan on the MMA Hour at the close of Bellator's sale to the PFL.
This is like the largest small industry in the world. There's millionaires being made. There's all these stars, but at the end, it's a handful of people that run it and a handful of people that have an ability to do anything with it.
And I think that's the issue the IFL struggled with and why the GFL investors may be wised up and pulled out. Almost none of those fighters are in their prime. Where are the new stars? Just the old names with heavy price tags. Even if it somehow does manage to get started after watching this video, you'll know the IFL team format did not work. The whole season structure hasn't worked for the PFL either, who just bailed out of that system this year. The IFL, or the GFL's failures, in reality have less to do with loss of funding and far more to do with nothing to viably fund. Most people were already extremely skeptical about the GFL's success, and it seems they'll never even have a chance to repeat the history of the IFL, and honestly, perhaps that's for the best. And in a graveyard now littered with the UFC's list of growing competitors, one championship cancelling a few dates of their own, PFL bleeding away their biggest names, perhaps the larger question is, will we ever see another MMA promotion challenge the UFC? I'll leave that one to you. Alright then, guys, bit of a history lesson for you today. If you didn't know about the IFL, you learned something. Maybe some of you did, revisiting the past, but yeah, the future of MMA, it looks like it's going to be all about the UFC. Before we do anything else though, we have to say thank you to Luke Taylor, guys. _. Give him a big round of applause for editing this one, these big long essays. He puts his life and soul into it. Shout out all to you channel members out there as well. Thanks for subscribing, supporting us. You make these longer videos possible. And don't forget, if you want to join up, guys, you can get into the writers meeting. Thank you for the support, channel members. Always good to have you here. Thanks, guys. Let me know in the comments down below what kind of video you want to see next, what essay you want to see next, guys. Happy to write more of them for you. This has been your history lesson with Balian. I'll see you in the next one.